Hey there, welcome to another edition of What's Hot with Sea of Tranquility. I am your host, as always, Pete Pardo, publisher of Sea of Tranquility. Visit us on the web at www.seaoftranquility.org. Today is Monday, April the 27th, and we've got kind of another special little program for you here today. I know we originally said we were going to be at Brian's Backyard Barbecue, but that got a little delayed till next week. So look for that coming up very, very soon. But for today, we're going to do another Forgotten Favorites episode, and we're going to focus on some of the great hard rock and metal bands of Canada. Why I decided to do this, I don't know. Just did a lot of great music up in Canada. I have a lot of favorite Canadian bands, so we're going to briefly look at a few of them today. So we're going to get started off with a very, very cool thrash metal band from Canada, led by the incomparable guitar skills of Jeff Waters. You guessed it, it's Annihilator. I got here Schizo Deluxe, which is their 2005 release. Really good stuff. I mean, this band has been around for quite a long time. Jeff is a very, very talented guitar player. They've had numerous lineup changes over the years. There's been a million singers that have come in and out of Annihilator. The one constant is always Mr. Waters himself, so you can be rest assured that every release will have his incomparable guitar skills. The guy's a complete riff master. He can shred with the best of them on lead guitar, and most Annihilator albums are really, really solid. Most folks tend to prefer the late 80s output from the band. I kind of have my personal favorites all throughout. This is, again, from 2005, one of my favorites from the more recent era. So, Annihilator, a Canadian thrash institution for well over 20 years. What else we got here? We're going to go back to 1973, April Wine, another very underrated rock and roll band from Canada, and this is their album Electric Jewels from 1973. Not one of the albums that normally gets talked about when one mentions April Wine. A lot of their late 70s, early 80s albums seem to be the most popular with the hardcore and casual fan, but I also like their really early 70s output. Really solid hard rock, some great pop melodies as well. Extremely, extremely overlooked band at times. April Wine, check out their whole discography. Most of it up until probably about 84 or so is actually really, really solid. And let's see, what do we got here? I mean, this band is a personal favorite of mine, these two albums. This is a 2-on-1. It's a Bachman Turner Overdrive, otherwise known as BTO. This is their 1974 and 1975 albums, Four Wheel Drive and Not Fragile. I mean, this is, sorry for the glare, this is some of the heaviest stuff of the early mid-70s. BTO were a really, really heavy hard rock, boogie, early metal, whatever you want to call them. There's just some great, great tunes on here. Not Fragile, Rolling Down the Highway, You Ain't Seen Nothing Yet, Freewheelin' Sledgehammer. Four Wheel Drive, Hey You, Quick Change Artist. I mean, it's just one great tune after another on these two albums released in succession. Back in 74 and 75, they're both here on this wonderful 2-disc collection. Actually, it's a single disc collection, 2 albums on 1 CD. So, again, BTO, heavy, heavy stuff for the time. We're going to fast forward a couple of years to 1979. Another one of those bands that just never seems to get enough acclaim is Max Webster. And, remember that name, Max Webster. They've had they had like 5 albums, 5 studio albums, I believe, 1 live album. And this is Mutiny Up My Sleeve. Very, very solid album. It's kind of hard to describe Max Webster. Oh, by the way, I'm wearing my Max Webster t-shirt today. Kind of bits of Frank Zappa, a little bit of the Tubes, all sorts of bits of prog and hard rock and pop. Very, very eclectic. Kim Mitchell was the lead guitar player and the vocalist, and a really, really talented musician. He wound up leading the band in the early 80s to start up a solo career, which he still continues to this day. But the Max Webster output is highly recommended. Really, really good band that probably should have been a lot bigger than they actually were. Now we're going to fast forward a couple more years to 1981. Hear it in the background, possibly. Frank Marino, The Power of Rock and Roll. Most of you know Frank Marino and Mahogany Rush, who's the band that he had throughout the 70s and most of the 80s. Put out a couple albums under his own name, which this is one of them. This is one of his more harder rocking affairs, but any way you look at it, a Frank Marino album is an experience. Sorry, a little nod to Jimi Hendrix, because he was often compared to Jimi Hendrix back in the day. He could do the Hendrix sound in his sleep, and he often did, but I think he brought a lot more to the table. Frank, for me, is probably one of the most underrated guitar players of all time. Probably the most kick-ass player of the 70s, and he still can rip it up with the best of them today. So this is one of my favorites among many. I like all the Frank Marino albums, but this one is pretty special. I'm going to back up a little bit to 1975. Maybe you never heard of this band before. Moxie is their 75 debut, self-titled. Really, really good hard rock band. In fact, uncredited on lead guitar and a few tracks on this album is none other than Tommy Bolin. But this band, their first three albums were stellar. Like I said, this is their debut. Probably my favorite of the three. But again, just really, really serious hard rock, 70s style hard rock. Again, band I highly recommend if you've never checked them out before. And let's see, how about 1980, Progress Saga. This is the Silent Night. Look at that wonderful cover artwork there. Most of their albums have really decent artwork on them. You know, this has got classics like Don't Be Late and Careful Where You Step. You know, Saga they kind of came after the golden years of progressive rock throughout the 70s. So when Saga hit the scene, kind of prog was sort of dead, but they kind of spearheaded that whole melodic prog second wave with lots of pop influences as well. But the musicianship was always stellar. Great guitar work, great vocals, lots of keyboards. Just a really, really good band that, again, were never a huge hit with audiences outside of, you know, Canada, Germany. They're enormous, still are to this day. Only had a couple small hits here in the U.S., but they're still around today. They've been around. They just keep pumping out albums and touring, and, you know, one really solid release after another. This is one of the earlier ones. I dig it a lot. Now, we all know Rush, right? Rush has got all those classic albums, so many of them. We're not even going to get into them today. I happen to like this little underrated gem quite a bit. This is Caress of Steel from 1975. You know, I think the critics hated this. Most hardcore Rush fans had like a secret love for this album, including myself. You know, Bastille Day, Lakeside Park, The Necromancer, The Fountains of Lamneth, you know, those two epics that finish off the album. This was Rush as they were just starting to get into their kind of sci-fi, progressive metal phase, which later appeared in full force on 2112 and Hemispheres and, you know, other albums. So, yeah, a definite forgotten favorite there. Let's see, 1979, Triumph, Just the Game. This was kind of my first introduction to Triumph. I remember hearing Lay It on the Line on the radio and thinking, wow, I love that. And, you know, a few short years later, these guys really kind of blew up. Allied Forces kind of took them to the next level. But I was really had a soft spot for this album because it's the first one I really heard from Triumph. So, again, another Canadian power trio, just like Rush, who, you know, did really well for themselves. It's a shame they're not still around today, although they did a little reunion a couple of years back. Let's see. We're going to stay in 1979. You know, this one, it's almost unfair to call this one a forgotten favorite because this is still perennial league. I'm not even going to bother going back there again. This is like one of the top live albums of the 70s, and most guitar players still to this day have a very fond heart for this particular album. This is Pat Travers Band Live, Go For What You Know. I mean, this is the classic Pat Travers Band lineup with Pat Thrall and Tommy Aldridge and Mars Cowling, and you know most of that band's best tunes are on this live album. It's just fantastic from start to finish, and it'll go down in the annals of rock guitar history as one of the best. So, and Pat Travers is still ripping it up today, putting out albums and touring all over the place. So, another great one. All right, so how about 1989? Now, you know, this is a band that personally I never paid much attention to, and just really never got. But you know, if you're going to have one, if you're kind of on the fence with Anvil, and you're going to only have one album by them, this is the Live in Concert from 1989. This is fun. You know, it's got most of their best tunes played live, so they kind of sound even cooler if that's possible. Again, I'm not a huge fan of Anvil, but I like having this because it kind of gives me the best of the best, I guess. So, and this reissue was put out by Metal Mind Production a few years back, and I sold a digipack. So, let's see. Here's an interesting little rarity. A band called War Pig. These guys were around the late 60s, early 70s, very brief career, but if you're a proto-metal fan, that wonderful little subgenre of hard rock that kind of morphed into what we now call heavy metal, these guys were probably somewhere in the back of the conversations, and this reissue from Relapse Records from a few years back kind of puts together some of those early recordings of War Pig. Again, if you love that really, really early hard rock metal sound, it's dark, heavy, cool stuff. I highly recommend that. Let's see. Let's go more recent now. Canada's very own Devin Townsend, year 2000. This is Ocean Machine. Devin's got a ton of really, really good releases to his credit, also with his former band, Strapping Young Lad, another great band from Canada. This is, again, Ocean Machine from 2000. This is a really good mix of progressive metal and progressive rock. There's some really atmospheric stuff on here. You know, you can really see the genius of Devin Townsend starting to kind of rise with this release and some of the ones that came after it. But this is probably one of my favorite of his from the early period of his solo stuff. And lastly, we're going to go to 1998 for technical death metal juggernauts, Gorguts, the classic Obscura. I mean, in my opinion, I don't think there's any better death metal band from Canada than Gorguts, and they kind of helped spearhead that whole technical death metal style. They have a couple other albums that came out before this that I think a lot of fans might like better. This was my first experience to Goreguts, and still to this day, it's my favorite. There's just some really amazing shit going on in this album that still to this day I listen to it and I'm like, wow, that's pretty damn impressive. Because let's face it, a lot of bands have come around in their wake and have put out these dazzling displays of brutality and ferocity and technical virtuosity that probably eclipses this. But you know what? These guys were doing it before. They were doing it first. And it's still, to listen to this album to this day, it's just pretty damn impressive. So that's my little journey up into Canada for you today. Some Canadian rock and metal and prog and all that good stuff. So thanks for bearing with me and, revisiting some of Canada's best. I'm sure there's more that I kind of forgot about. I would have liked to talk about some Cataclysm and a few other bands, but we only have a certain amount of time and I didn't want to go overboard on today's show. So anyway, with that, I will be leaving you till next week. Like I said, we will be finally at Brian's Backyard Barbecue to talk about all the great music that he's got appearing at the restaurant and in his backyard at his festival in June. So be sure to tune in for that. We'll also be talking about some cool forgotten favorites with Brian. He's also a big hard rock and blues guitar fan, so we'll have plenty to talk about. So. And then the following week, we'll be doing our regularly scheduled programming with some hot new releases. And coming up in the near future, we're also going to be heading back to Rock Fantasy to visit with Steve Keeler, as well as The Warehouse with Dan Brown. So make sure you stay tuned each and every week. Follow us on the web at www.seatranquility.org. We're also on Twitter as well as Facebook. So all you social media-ites, make sure to find us at all various places and follow us and like us and all that good stuff so we can continue to keep bringing you all this cool content each and every week. So, again, take care. Make sure you put some of this stuff in your wish list. Always make sure you're checking out great new tunes. Keep it alive. We'll see you next week.